Hi, my name is Nelson Campbell. Welcome to our show today on the topic of reductionism in nutrition. I'm joined today by the person who may be the world's most prominent expert on this topic, my father, Dr. T. Colin Campbell. As many of you may know, my father did much of the key research validating the health benefits of a plant-based diet. Over a career spanning more than half a century, publishing over 350 highly technical peer-reviewed papers. He also helped to launch the plant-based nutrition movement with his landmark book, The China Study. Thank you, Dad, for joining me in this important discussion today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to start our discussion today with a couple of stories from the book that you're currently finishing. One that I found to be very interesting was the story of Frederick Hoffman and the claims that he made about diet and health.
Yeah, Hoffman, who lived in the late 1800s and most of the 1900s, did a number of things. He was a founder of the American Cancer Society, in which case he said at that time that among the things that society should consider is a possibility that nutrition is involved in cancer. Unfortunately, his name was almost totally forgotten.
And in your book, actually, there are other characters who also were making the connection of diet to disease, and specifically animal protein to disease. And one that really caught my eye, and of course I knew his story from before, but it's a fella, George McIlwain, in the, I believe it was the early 1800s, and he was a prominent physician in England, I believe, and he actually became a well-known proponent of a plant-based diet, and people kind of thought he was crazy.
Yeah, he was a man who was born in 1797, to be specific, and he started out his career basically as a practicing physician. They called him surgeons in those days. And he kind of got onto the idea that in the early part of his career that there was something about a plant-based diet was important. In fact, at age 41, he actually switched to become a vegetarian. What he defended that proposition on was the idea that cancer is caused by a very multiple factors. It was a whole body response. He called it the constitutional nature of disease.
So before we actually, I'd like to dig into this idea of the constitutional nature of disease, because it's connected with the topic that we're addressing today. But before we do, there's an interesting connection of George McIlwain to you. What is that?
I was in London at the time, or in Oxford, and I was looking into the history of the whole fields of nutrition cancer, the separate fields of nutrition cancer. And his book came to my attention. When I was reading it, this is in 1985, 86, midway through my career, I felt like, I felt this really had almost a sensation of feeling that I wrote the book. So I started looking into who was this guy, George McIlwain. And all of a sudden I recalled the fact that about 15 years before, your mom and I had taken my dad and my mother back to Ireland where he was born. And he met some family, including some first cousins, who knew quite a bit about my dad's mother, my grandmother. And her name, last name, or maiden name was McIlwain. I'm convinced he was either my great-grandfather or my great-uncle.
It's pretty remarkable that there was this crazy plant-based advocate running around the early 1800s.
He didn't use the word plant-based, but he basically talked about nutrition. And he talked about other factors that obviously led to that concept.
Yeah, but he did advocate a plant-based diet, and he lived it.
He lived it.
He lived that.
He lived it.
So maybe his spirit is in you.
I don't know. It's
So he was a big proponent, as were a few others, of this constitutional theory of disease. So what exactly does that mean?
Well, in those days there were, generally speaking, two views. One was called the local theory of disease, in which case cancer just suddenly appears as a disease someplace in your body, and therefore it can be cut out. That was a surgeon's view. Also, there was the view too that cancer was caused by a specific agent. In contrast to that, McIlwain's view, and before him John Abernathy and so forth, their view was, no, that's not really what it is. It's the whole body response. There's something more going on here. And that was his way of, quite frankly, defending the proposition of nutrition being involved.
So that sounds a lot to me like the distinction between what you oftentimes refer to as reductionism and holism. Holism being the constitutional theory of disease and reductionism being the local theory of disease. Is that, do you see it that way? And how would you succinctly define holism?
You're quite correct. The local theory of disease, which eventually became adopted as the main reason for cancer occurring, that's what really got adopted by the professions at that time in the late 1800s.
Treat cancer with surgery and radiation and chemotherapy.
Yeah, very specific, identifiable sort of causes and treatments. In contrast, cancer, physical constitutional disease obviously involves the whole body. That's holism, what I call holism, with a W in front of it. In which case then we're talking about whole food. We're talking about the infinite numbers of factors in food, many of which are called nutrients, actually working together to create the response. And not to create a single response, creating a lot of responses.
So seeing through a holistic lens, you're really acknowledging this infinite and mysterious complexity that is biology. And you're also recognizing the self-healing, the self-correcting nature of that complexity, as opposed to seeing biology as you would see a machine and seeing it in discrete pieces and then trying to intervene and change those pieces to change the whole. So it's really, that's two very different ways of seeing biology.
I couldn't describe it better. You did a good job.
And it's interesting because in history, going back to McIlwain and others, and of course yourself, people who've advocated a more holistic view have gotten a lot of blowback, haven't they?
Definitely. I mean, of course, that's the question, exactly the question that I was sort of asking myself. You know, because initially I was interested in doing this history because of the blowback I was getting at that time, already pretty intense.
What do you think motivates people to think in a reductionist way?
Well, partly it's the search for the magic bullet. That's one thing that we do, I guess. We can make money. We can pick out a single agent, for example, in food and maybe turn it into a specific nutrient, put it in a pill. We can even go further. We can create a new chemical, unknown to nature. That's the drug industry.
So seeing the body as a machine that we can manipulate is great for the capitalist system, right?
That's right.
It's easy to make money if we see it that way. And something else that we've talked about a lot too is, I know we both agree on, but I'll just mention it. Another factor driving a kind of reductionist way of seeing is quite frankly, it's ego, it's the desire to be an authority, it's the desire to be in control. I know that in your life, and in fact you detail this in this third book that you're completing, you've had to deal with that all of your working life, and you've made a lot of people very uncomfortable. People who do see themselves as authorities. Here you come along and you say, no, it's really nature, and we just need to sit back and give the body what it needs and it'll take care of itself. That's kind of unsettling sometimes to people.
Yes, of course. I mean, to people who use their ego to make arguments, they basically own something. They're getting money. And it does come from ego, and eventually it leads to control.
Or money or influence.
Yeah, that's just the way.
Reputation.
Exactly.
Yeah. So in your book, in this third book, you detail some of the struggles that you've had confronting this reductionist viewpoint. And you make a point about the societal consequences of reductionism. What are the consequences of reductionism to society in your profession, the profession of nutrition and health?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is the fact that it causes confusion. When you have so many things, and there's an infinite number of factors we can discover, if we just pick up one at a time and we see something about it that we can sort of tell stories about it, then all of a sudden you've got everybody sort of picking out their favorite sort of chemical or nutrient or substance in the food and trying to make a business out of it. Or if not, just simply talking about it. So confusion is the biggest consequence. Enormous confusion occurs.
Well, something else that you've always said, and it's really kind of what I was driving at here, is in this environment of confusion where no one really understands the truth, there's no guiding light, it creates the opportunity for corruption. It creates the opportunity for corruption in industry and in government and our healthcare system. It allows people to pursue their own selfish agendas because there is no fixed point of truth. And so when you think about it, the deck is really stacked against the public. And in this environment, you've got some pretty powerful industries, and all these industries have their stooges in Washington, and they're manipulating the public. And so you and I, we don't need to talk about this today, but I know that we agree that the only way to counteract that is by getting the truth out to the public in a more grassroots way, empowering people to do that in their own communities. And if you can pull people together around the truth, it can be a powerful force, but it's not easy to do. And I know we both agree on that. There are many obstacles to this idea of a grassroots movement. And what I'd like to focus on for the rest of our discussion is one of those obstacles that relates to this idea of reductionism. And you and I have always said this, we agree on this, that in order to build a plant-based world, we have to give people food that is pleasurable, that is joyful. Unfortunately, I think there are some ideas circulating in our community that make this challenging. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to discuss a few of these ideas and then provide an opportunity for you to comment on these things, because this is very, very important. It's urgent that we build a plant-based world for reasons of health and our environment and our climate. And we don't have as much time to do this as we may think. So the first idea that I'd like to have you comment on, it's an idea that's become quite prevalent in the community, is this idea of a SOS Free Diet. That means a diet that's has no salt, no refined oils, no refined sugars. And of course, we agree on the oil part of that. You don't need oil to produce great tasting food. And oil's definitely not a good thing, and it's easy for people to overindulge in oil. But what about this notion of eliminating every last grain of salt and sugar from food?
I think it's really been, that discussion has been way overextended. The idea that somehow by doing that we're going to be healthy, it doesn't make any sense. There's really no scientific evidence in my mind that actually supports that point of view. It's a form of reductionism. So it's focusing on, if I just don't have any of that, I'm going to get better, or this. That's really, that's foolishness, total foolishness. It just simply does not make sense. And in the process, we tend to ignore the big story. The big story is eating that food, first off. Secondly, some using that carefully, let's say the salt and the sugar, actually can help to sell the bigger idea in many cases. Obviously, you don't want to overdo it. A little bit. Be careful. Don't live on that all day long. Nobody does really. But we have no scientific evidence to show that eliminating every last crystal of either salt or sugar that's going to be gaining health. Nonsense.
So kind of what I hear you saying is that fixating on this idea of eliminating every last grain of salt and sugar in your food is reductionist because it's ignoring the holistic effects of a whole food plant-based diet. So, and we've talked about this before, when we eat a whole food plant-based diet, there's a tsunami of healing effects. And fixating on eliminating every last grain of salt and sugar, it's a little bit like fixating on a ripple in front of the tsunami. It's just not consequential, it's not really important. And of course it makes it very difficult again to share this diet with mainstream folks.
Fixating on those details really diverts attention away from the big story. It's that simple.
Yeah.
Furthermore, we don't have the scientific evidence to say the absolute absence of those substances is harmful. We don't have that. In fact, we can make arguments that may be helpful, especially in regards to the fact it helps people to use this whole food plant-based diet.
Mm-hmm. And of course, just to be clear, we're not advocating for heavy use of salt and sugar. We're only talking about, is it okay to use low amounts of salt and sugar in your food to create flavor? Another idea that I hear a lot of in the community today is this phrase, the fat you eat is the fat you wear. And of course, when it comes to the consumption of refined oils, I think there's some merit to that idea. But I hear a lot of people advocating against the consumption of whole foods like nuts, seeds, avocados, and coconuts. What do you think about that and this notion of the fat you eat is the fat you wear?
First of all, the fat you eat is the fat you wear. That's a very superficial comment to make. It doesn't work that way biochemically. We should not be making that statement, first off. Secondly, the fat we talk about that may be problematic is the added oil isolated from the whole food. The food itself, like nuts and seeds and so forth and so on, they're kind of rich in, there's a reason for nature putting that in there. It enables them to get a kickstart, when they start growing new plants, as an aside. But to say that the whole food is the problem also is not correct. In fact, the evidence shows that nuts, a lot of evidence, very convincing evidence, that nuts, if anything, have a benefit. They're rich in vitamin E, for example. That I've known that in the trade for decades. A lot of us in business have known that. And to eat nuts, of course, is higher in fat for a specific reason. We don't want to just make up a whole meal just of nuts and seeds, quite frankly. But that's good food. And the evidence shows it's good food. It's that simple.
I know that you just did a really deep dive into all of the research out there on nuts, and you were quite impressed by what you saw. And again, we're talking about modest consumption of nuts. So consuming nuts as nature would present them to us. So not eating bags of shelled nuts, but maybe it's a handful of walnuts on your oatmeal in the morning or something like that. And the evidence all suggests that that's actually heart healthy, according to what you found.
Yes.
And that makes sense when you think about it on an intuitive level, because you always argue that a plant-based diet is optimal because it comes from nature. It's what's natural to us. It's what we evolved on over time. And I always remember being a kid and Mom shooing us out of the house, and we were outside most every day, and I used to hike and camp and ride horses, and the forests were littered with nuts. I could ride across our farm in Virginia and find 3 or 4 different kinds of nuts and would stop and eat and go on to the next thing. And of course, in the tropical regions where humanity spent so much time, there are avocados and coconuts. And somehow I don't see our ancestors having walked around with lab equipment measuring the fat content of an avocado.
No,
Do you?
I would say. Yeah, it is part of nature, as you said.
Yeah.
Really.
The other thing that you've mentioned before, and you might want to comment on it here, is that the logic behind this statement, the fat you eat, the fat you wear, is the very same logic that the dairy industry used to promote dairy consumption. Basically what they said is eat these calcium-rich foods because the calcium you eat is the calcium that your bones will wear, right? That you'll wear in your bones. It's good for your bones. When in reality now we're finding that societies that consume high levels of dairy and meat products actually have weaker bones. In fact, their bones are not wearing the calcium. It doesn't work that way. Biology is not so simple. It's not just what you intake, it's how the body utilizes what you consume.
I think the best answer for that calcium question, this is evidence that was available back in the 1980s and before, by a friend of mine, by the way. But that evidence, simply, if you plot the calcium intake in different societies against the rate of bone fracture, which in turn is related to osteoporosis, the higher the calcium intake, the higher the fracture rate. Just to go along with what you just said. More calcium, excessive calcium in that particular form, causes health problems, not solutions.
Right, so just eating more calcium-rich foods like milk and cheese doesn't ensure that your body's going to retain that calcium.
That was a good sign, a good example of reductionism, by the way. Giving special value just to that one element, calcium. Of course, calcium is important, but it is being used to sell a food product.
Yeah. So when you hear that the fat you eat is the fat you wear, you're hearing kind of a reductionist thought, because it's not taking into account what happens after you eat the avocado or the nut or the seed. It gives no consideration to what happens in your body and how it's utilized.
It's a superficial comment from one point of view, and that is that we're thinking that suggests all fat's the same. It's not.
Yeah.
So leave that out.
So another category of ideas circulating in the community is this notion of eating certain foods because somehow certain plant foods are better than other plant foods. And I've heard, for example, the advice to overconsume really greens and having multiple servings of greens a day because maybe it promotes production of nitric oxide and helps with endothelial function, maybe somehow prevents heart disease. But in reality, heart disease is an incredibly complex process that occurs over time. So does it make sense to seize on one sliver of that process and then look at a food that may affect that one sliver and then advocate for the overconsumption of that food? Is that something that makes sense?
It is. It's not appropriate. It's simply not appropriate to focus on one mechanism. It can be used for discussion to illustrate how things work, but it should be left at that. One mechanism being used to describe a whole condition, that's inappropriate, because what happens if we take that approach, there's somebody wants to come along and find a chemical to, let's say, enhance it or block it.
Or a food.
Or, yeah.
Another idea kind of in this category is this notion of nutrient density. The idea that some foods are more, quote, nutrient dense than other foods, and therefore should be consumed in greater quantities. And of course, if we accept that line of thinking, maybe we shouldn't even be eating the lowly potato, right? I mean, what do you think about this idea of nutrient density?
I've been involved with that concept since I was in graduate school, but the concept of nutrient density has been really seriously distorted. First off, in order to determine how nutrient dense, let's say, a food is, you have to know how much of different nutrients are in there in theory. You have to decide on how much value to give to individual nutrients. So it's all a constructed bunch of nonsense, actually. I can remember the day when milk was the most nutrient-dense food of all. Now today it's something different. Maybe spinach or kale or something like that. No, that nutrient density concept should be stricken from our language. It really has nothing to do with the scientific evidence that we have.
And there may be some foods like the lowly potato that maybe it's not as, quote, nutrient dense, but it's still important, right?
Well, the potato, I'd like to make another comment on that one there too, is a great source of energy. But interestingly, also, that potato alone, or potatoes alone, have enough protein, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Has enough protein. We don't need any more protein from other sources like animals.
Yeah. And there's value to just starch.
There's value to, yeah, of course.
Yeah. So there are many of these kinds of ideas, and I just wanted to discuss a few of them as examples of the kind of reductionist thinking that I know has bothered you, that's emerging in the very community that you helped to spawn. So this brings us to the really key point of our discussion here, and this is what you always say, and I love it when you say this, which is that it's really simple. There's no need to obsess about all these details. Just focus on eating all the different parts of the plant. Make sure you get plenty of color in your diet. And it's okay to use a little bit of salt and sugar to flavor your food so that you can enjoy it, so that you can derive pleasure from it. And it's as simple as that, right?
One more thing. I just have sort of two suggestions. One is eat the whole food plant-based diet, basically, and stay away from foods that have animal protein in it. That's the goal, at least. It's whole
Well,
food.
you know, the other thing that we see, and you know, we're involved in social media, and we see some of these things. The reductionist way of thinking, it also tends to be connected with judgment, extreme views, and judging others who don't to live up to those standards. And you know, I think we need to take a different approach if we're going to build a plant-based world, and it has to be one grounded in a compassionate perspective. And I'll just share a little story to make the point here. We were having some housework done, and we had a handyman come by to help us out, and we started talking and learned that he was suffering from type 2 diabetes. And so we told him what we do, and I say we, it's my wife Kim and I, she was with me. And he said, I might be interested in that, but I'm a really picky eater. You know, this is a guy who eats at Bojangles every day. Really nice gentleman. And we said, you'd be surprised you could enjoy this food. And so it just so happened that Kim was making some burritos for lunch that day, and she was experimenting, as she always is, creating new things, and gave him a couple of the burritos. He absolutely loved it. And he said, if I could eat this every day, he said, I'd be plant-based. And, making the diet accessible to people like him is an act of compassion. And also, I look out in some of these underserved communities where our healthcare crisis is most severe, and I look at the way those people are suffering. And I think we need to, in our community, we need to replace the urge to be right and to judge with the impulse to express compassion. And I think if we do that, we can create foods that people enjoy, and we can change our world around this idea. So that's all I'm going to say, but I want to give you the floor here at the end to say whatever you want to say after this discussion.
Well, I think the entire community, whether it's the plant-based community or otherwise, rely on information that's available to us. We form opinions around it according to our own personal preferences, I guess. But it's related to the information that's provided to us. So therefore, the question is, well, what is that information? Who's creating the information? And unfortunately, if you look back in history, the information we're getting has been basically controlled. And now these days by institutions, whether they are governmental, corporate, scientific, medical, whatever. Institutions have an outsized bit of power. They create the information in their own interest. The public's not getting access to information. In fact, it's very hard right now for the public to get the kind of information that is of most use to them. They're confused. They can't figure out all these details. understandably so. The professionals even argue over what the details are. So the idea is to come back, and what a person asks themselves, how much information do I need? And it's really very simple. We said it before. Eat the whole food but plant-based diet. Flavor it up a bit with herbs, spices, and a little sugar and salt doesn't hurt. Make the food tasty, so that people do that, and they will get just that simple notion, and just try to avoid the animal protein-based foods, and that will turn the world around.
So what we need is a grassroots movement that empowers people and communities to share that simple idea.
That's it.
Right? It's very, very simple. Well, thank you for joining me on the show today. I know you and I talk about these things a lot privately, and it's been fun to talk about this and share this more publicly. I'm sure this will generate a lot of interest. So thank you for being part of this.